pitch for the presidency. Rates cut to a historic low, the Reserve Bank signalling the economy is not out of the woods yet. Austrian authorities say at least one Islamist terrorist was behind a deadly attack in Vienna. And the race that stops the nation as never seen before, the Melbourne Cup runs to an empty Flemington. Hello, welcome to ABC News. I'm Karina Carvalho. It's election day in the United States and soon a verdict on the presidency of Donald Trump will be delivered. He and his Democratic challenger Joe Biden have been racing across key states in a final push to voters. And concerns are building in the deeply divided nation. There could be violence as results come in, with city streets being boarded up in case of unrest. Catherine Diss reports from the battleground state of Pennsylvania.
Even in the final hours of his campaign, Donald Trump's still throwing everything he's got at voters.
This does not look like a second-place finish.
Scranton, Pennsylvania was just one of 5 rallies he staged in a last-ditch sweep of the battleground states.
Go Donald!
Go Trump!
The result here matters. Without Pennsylvania, the president knows he's unlikely to keep the Oval Office.
Vote tomorrow, vote in person. Let's get this win.
Lagging in the polls, he's also undermining the result and the Supreme Court's decision to extend counting of postal votes beyond Election Day.
They did a very bad thing for this state. They did a very bad thing for this nation. You have to have a date. You can't extend dates.
This is the president's 5th visit to Pennsylvania in just 3 days. He's come to a county he won handsomely in 2016 by wooing across working-class voters. Well, it sure feels like he's winning here on the ground. The bigger question, can he turn that support into votes at the ballot box tomorrow?
My gut tells me he's going to win. If he doesn't win, there's something radically wrong.
Got to make the world go round.
But this is Joe Biden's hometown and he's got strong support.
It's time for Donald Trump to pack his bags and go home. Go home.
For longing for change.
Celebrities like Lady Gaga are campaigning for Joe Biden.
Who loves Joe?
And that's irking the president on the eve of the election.
Now he's got Lady Gaga. Lady Gaga is not too good. I could tell you plenty of stories. I could tell you stories about Lady Gaga. I know a lot of stories about Lady Gaga.
This country is nervous, with many people fearing violence if celebrations or protests get out of control. In many cities, streets are being closed and stores boarded up, even on one of Los Angeles' most famous shopping strips, Rodeo Drive. After a year of unrest and looting, the chaos in the United States could get even worse. Catherine Diss, ABC News, Scranton, Pennsylvania.
While Joe Biden is ahead in all the major polls, the big question is if he can win enough college votes to be elected president. Here's ABC election analyst Anthony Green with a look at which states Mr. Biden needs to win to beat Donald Trump.
In 2016, Donald Trump was elected the United States president by painting the states of the United States those colours. He won 306 electoral college votes to Hillary Clinton's 232. Now, we've painted the same numbers for Joe Biden's candidacy, and you've got to look at the path of the states he can gain to get to 270, the number of electoral college votes you need to be elected president. Now, the most likely state for him to win is Wisconsin, and beyond that, Michigan. That would get Joe Biden to 258, and he needs one more state. The state which he's talked about most is Pennsylvania. That gets him to 278. If he doesn't win Pennsylvania, then the state he needs to turn blue is Florida. And that would also get him to be president. But if he doesn't win Florida, he needs another state. And that's the most talked about opportunity is North Carolina. If that turns blue, then Joe Biden wins a narrow electoral college vote. And beyond that, there are other possibilities, but those 6 states are the ones that you are going to hear most about on Wednesday.
And we'll have full coverage tomorrow of the US election on ABC News and ABC TV, beginning with News Breakfast, then throughout the day as the results come in. At 7 o'clock Eastern Daylight Time, there'll be a special hour-long edition of ABC News hosted by Lee Sales, and I'll be here with the day's other news. Australia's Reserve Bank has slashed the official cash rate to a record low of 0.1%. Since the year began, the RBA has cut rates 3 times in an attempt to stimulate the economy amid the COVID-19 recession. Prior to today's rate cut, the cash rate was 0.25%. The RBA Governor Philip Lowe explained the decision.
Today's package has 3 elements. These are, first, a reduction in the cash rate target, the 3-year yield target and the interest rate on new drawings under the term funding facility to just 10 basis points from the current 25 basis points. Second, a reduction in the interest rate on exchange settlement balances to 0 from the current 10 basis points. And third, the introduction of a program of government bond purchases. In particular, we're intending to buy $100 billion of government bonds over the next 6 months, purchasing bonds issued by the Australian Government and by the states and territories. Together, these 3 elements represent a very significant package. The lower interest rates and our plan to buy $100 billion of government bonds over the next 6 months will help people get back into jobs, and it will support the recovery of the Australian economy.
St George Bank Chief Economist Bessedita says the announcement was anticipated.
The market was anticipating that the RBA would announce a bond buying program for bonds beyond the 3-year maturities, and the estimate was at around $100 billion, and that was also in line with our own expectations.
So even before the pandemic, we had been talking about whether the RBA would pursue a quantitative easing program. It's essentially money printing. What's the likely impact of this bond buying scheme?
Well, the impact of the bond buying scheme, as well as the other package of measures that the RBA has announced today, is intended to lower lending rates across the economy. It's also intended to lower the Australian dollar than otherwise would be the case. And it's also intended to lift asset prices and thereby help improve the balance sheets of households, and then hopefully increase spending by both households and businesses. And in that way, bolster the economic recovery, which is quite fragile, and also promote jobs. And the RBA Governor made it quite clear that the package of these measures was intended to boost jobs and minimise the rise in the unemployment rate, because they're quite worried about the long-term impact of the pandemic on the unemployment rate.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about that, because I wanted to ask you what you thought of those comments from Philip Lowe about job creation and how critical it is to the health of the economy, and what the central bank's role is in helping that to happen.
Well, jobs growth is very critical. We know that the scarring from recessions and downturns can have very long-term impacts on the labour market. Now, the federal government, when it delivered its federal budget earlier in October, it also made jobs a very big priority. And I think we've seen the RBA do exactly the same thing. So the idea is to try and bolster the economic recovery by lowering lending rates and increase spending, and in that way create more jobs in the economy.
Yeah, so what does it tell us about the state of the economy? Because Philip Lowe was also talking about household spending and employment being better than expected, that GDP probably increased in the September quarter. So how do these things marry up?
Yes, certainly what we also saw in today's statement from the RBA is they actually lifted their near-term growth forecasts, and they also lowered the peak in the unemployment rate, as well as where they thought the unemployment rate would end by 2022. But I guess this pandemic is a once-in-a-lifetime shock. There's a shock to all economies around the world. There is no vaccine, so there's considerable risks and uncertainty around the outlook. And I guess what had become clear to the RBA is that these package of measures are best delivered in order to help improve the economic outlook and bolster that economic recovery story. And also what we took from the RBA press conference that the RBA Governor delivered is that the best impact would be delivered when Australia was out of lockdown. So rather than delivering these package of measures whilst Australia was in lockdown, that they were waiting for the impact to be greater, which would be when Australia was out of lockdown.
Besadita there. And you can see more on the Reserve Bank's decision on the business tonight with Elise Morgan right after the news. Several people are dead and more than a dozen injured after a series of shootings in Austria which have been labelled terrorist attacks. One gunman was shot dead, but authorities believe several others are on the run. Residents of Vienna are being urged to remain in their homes as special forces from across Europe join the investigation. Europe correspondent Samantha Hawley reports.
Cafes in Vienna's popular Old Town district were packed when the attack broke out.
Suddenly the shooting started. We started to run away. We did not know if we were running in the right direction.
They were shooting at least 100 rounds just in front of our building.
Early reports suggested the Stadttempel synagogue was the target, but Rabbi Shlomo Hofmeister says this seemed unlikely because the building was closed.
Upon hearing some shots downstairs, I looked down the window and I saw the attacker running into various bars and restaurants and people running away, and this one or two attackers chasing them all over the street.
Australian photographer Samuel Eder arrived shortly after the assaults. He believes they were timed for major impact.
In fact, today was the last night, so the gunmen started their attack before the entire city needed to go into lockdown, and obviously there are a lot of people out and about.
Police confirmed there were at least 6 crime scenes. One attacker has been shot dead by anti-terror officers. He was armed with an assault rifle and wearing a fake suicide vest.
Von mindestens einem islamistischen Terroristen.
Austria's Interior Minister Karl Nehammer described the suspect as an Islamic State group sympathiser whose home had been searched and video material seized. French President Emmanuel Macron was among the first to condemn the shootings, tweeting, "This is our Europe. Our enemies must know who they are dealing with. We will not give up." Samantha Hawley, ABC News.
Rescuers in Turkey have freed a toddler from the rubble of her collapsed apartment building nearly 3 days after a powerful earthquake struck the region. They described finding the 3-year-old girl as a miracle. She was taken to hospital and is recovering well. One of the rescuers thought he'd found another body in the debris until he went to wipe dust from her face and she grabbed his thumb. The girl's mother and 2 sisters were rescued 2 days earlier. At least 94 people died in Turkey and Greece when the quake struck. A rookie jockey and a veteran owner have combined to win the Melbourne Cup at an empty Flemington racecourse. On a day when racegoers were banned from the track, Jai McNeil produced a bold front-running ride on the Irish horse Twilight Payment to deliver owner Lloyd Williams a 7th Cup win. One of the pre-race favourites, Anthony Van Dyke, broke down in the home straight and was euthanased after the race.
The best plans are often the simple ones. In his maiden Melbourne Cup, Jai McNeil took Twilight Payment to the front early and said, "Catch me if you can."
Twilight Payment tries to break their heart.
Tiger Moth and Prince of Arran came close, but not close enough.
What a ride, what a win in a cup we'll never forget.
A dream debut for a 25-year-old jockey on the rise.
It was more a little bit of pressure on me just to get it right, and thankfully it all came off.
It was a day for adopting new plans. Coronavirus restrictions kept the gates closed at Flemington and the trains idle. A cup day without racegoers would have been unthinkable a year ago, but there's nothing like a pandemic to put things in perspective.
After the 100 days of lockdown, just to see people out and about having a good time, it's fantastic.
With the day at the races off the cards, Melburnians still dressed up to celebrate. Angela Menz hasn't missed a cup in 14 years. This year, she brought the Flemington experience to her lounge room.
This is my favourite time of year. Other people get excited about Christmas. I get excited about the Melbourne Cup.
Over more than a century and a half of Melbourne Cups, Flemington has seen countless triumphs, tragedies, the weird and the wonderful. But it's never seen anything quite like this. The lawns are empty, the stands are silent, but at least the roses look the part.
It's my 31st Cup, and it just feels like a sort of another workday at the moment. There's not much atmosphere.
Around the country, racing fans embraced what Melburnians could only imagine. Instead of mingling at the course, nervous owners and connections were logging in from afar. While there was plenty that made this Melbourne Cup unlike any other, one trend tragically continued. As the horses thundered for home, one of the pre-race favourites, Anthony Van Dyke, broke a leg and was later put down.
Sadly, we expected this to happen today. It's more likely now that a horse will be killed in the Melbourne Cup than not.
It's the 7th horse to die on Cup Day in 8 years. A terrible price for Australia's biggest race. Damien McIver, ABC News.
An anti-lockdown protest in Melbourne quickly descended into chaos today, with more than 400 protesters arrested and a police officer taken to hospital with a suspected broken arm. Away from the city, swarms of beachgoers, many without masks, prompted authorities to warn there are still undetected cases of coronavirus, even though today was the 4th consecutive day of no new cases or deaths. Here's Bridget Rollison.
The biggest gathering in Melbourne today wasn't at the racetrack. Hundreds of protesters rallied against COVID restrictions near the steps of State Parliament, despite the city's lockdown ending almost a week ago. Police used capsicum spray to control an unruly crowd who were demanding the Premier resign. Hundreds were arrested.
We're free when we return back to the way it was. We're free when we can go around with no masks.
There will be a time for protests. In the middle of a response to a global pandemic is not the time.
While some Melburnians were calling for more freedom, others were making the most of their new liberties. Beaches were the busiest they've been in months and parks were packed as people soaked up the sunshine.
This is 24 k's from our home, so we just made it in.
It's good to get out of the house, enjoy the nice weather.
Definitely choosing the beach over the race today, no regrets.
For the first time since February, Victoria recorded a 4th consecutive day of no new cases and no deaths. The number of active cases has dropped to 38 in Victoria, 10 fewer than New South Wales. But another mystery case has been added to Melbourne's tally in Deer Park, bringing the overall total to 2.
We have a good understanding of the Deer Park case that first presented at towards the end of last week. We put a very swift testing response in around that wider Deer Park community. All the contacts and the secondary contacts are fully isolated.
Health authorities have praised the nearly 13,000 Victorians who turned out to get tested yesterday. But they suspect there are still undetected cases in the community. They've warned the pandemic is far from over and are worried about people letting their guard down.
If you're on the beach, if you're in the park, wear a mask. It's the easiest thing we can all do to do our bit to keep ourselves safe.
But out on the water, that message might not be getting through to everyone. Bridget Rollison, ABC News, Melbourne.
South Australia has indicated it may lift its travel ban on Victorians within a fortnight. The state is monitoring how well Victoria fares under eased restrictions, which are allowing more people to move around in the community. Anyone travelling to South Australia would still have to self-isolate for a fortnight on arrival, but could do so in a home rather than a medi-hotel.
Victoria is doing well. That's giving us confidence that we can ease those restrictions, especially as we head into the crucial Christmas period.
From midnight tonight, South Australia is also removing the required weekly coronavirus tests for people living in cross-border communities. It's also hoped the 70-kilometre bubble for border communities could soon be extended. More people across New South Wales can now freely travel to Queensland, but the vast majority of the state's population living in Greater Sydney is still locked out.
Separated for months, people are finally reuniting as the borders reopen.
It's just been really, really difficult, so yeah, finally home.
Many of Brisbane's arrivals have returned from overseas, relieved to be home after spending 14 days in hotel quarantine.
I think I started trying to leave London back in June. Finally got on a flight at the end of October, had 6 flight cancellations.
Sydney-siders aren't so lucky. They're still shut out from the Sunshine State.
I am dumbfounded as to think why the Queensland Premier thinks that there's any logic whatsoever in regard to this approach.
The answer is no. We said very clearly that we would make those decisions at the end of the month.
New South Wales cases have remained consistently low over recent weeks. The state recorded one new case, a staff member at Jasmine's restaurant at Liverpool. The Lebanese restaurant didn't have a COVID-safe plan or keep contact details of patrons.
We know the consequences of people being complacent means that we get the virus spreading through our communities.
Anyone who visited for more than an hour on October the 26th or last weekend is being urged to isolate and get tested. Rani Hayman, ABC News, Sydney.
As Queensland's LNP confronts its election loss at the weekend, the big question for the party is who will lead it in opposition for the next 4 years. The only person to put his hand up so far is David Crisafulli, a former minister in the Newman government. Here's Stephanie Zillman.
Getting back on the horse, Deb Frecklington spent race day in Cumbia near Kingaroy, just a day after formally stepping down as leader of the LNP following her party's election defeat.
It is so good to be back in Kingaroy.
And while it wasn't the race she wanted to win, the outgoing opposition leader says her replacement will have her full support and loyalty.
I'm not going to pick any favourites or publicly declare who I would back, but I do have confidence in my party room that will make the right decision.
So far, only one person has publicly declared a tilt for the LNP leadership, David Crisafulli, the re-elected member for Broadwater. He served as a minister in the Newman government, a factor that Labor will no doubt exploit. In a statement, he says, "I will be asking my colleagues for their support and sharing with them my plan for rebuilding." Tim Mander has announced he will also step down, making the deputy position the more hotly contested race. North Queensland MP Dale Last, David Janetsky of Toowoomba and Christian Rowan in Brisbane all declaring they will run. Serial contender Fiona Simpson,
"I'd love the job,"
has ruled herself out.
In the next few days, more will be revealed in regard to who our new leader will be, and I will be supporting the best person for the job.
All of the LNP members and members of Parliament need to be rowing in the one direction for a change. We haven't seen a lot of that.
Premier Palaszczuk doesn't care.
Not worried at all. That's a matter for the LNP to lick their wounds after the weekend.
The LNP won't vote on their new leadership team until the final count is known. With 6 seats still in doubt, they're not yet sure exactly who will be in the party room. Bundaberg, Burleigh, Coomera, Currumbin, Glasshouse and Nicklin are still too close to call.
Once it's clear on preferences, we'll be able to declare.
That's not expected until early next week. Stephanie Zillman, ABC News, Brisbane.
The WA government says there are no plans to take the 25 crew members off a damaged livestock carrier which had to be diverted to Geraldton on Western Australia's mid-west coast. The Barclay Pearl has a large hole in its hull. It was about 120 kilometres north of Geraldton when the Australian Maritime Safety Authority was told about the problem. An AMSAR plane flew over the ship and reported it was listing to one side, leading to serious concerns it may not reach Indonesia safely. The carrier was diverted to Geraldton, where it's in port having the damage assessed. The stricken ship is not carrying any livestock on board. WA's Premier has warned the state's rock lobster industry appears to be the latest casualty in the souring diplomatic relations between Australia and China. Over the weekend, China refused to allow millions of dollars worth of Australian rock lobster entry at customs, with Beijing saying there may have been metal contamination. Australian timber and barley exports have also been blocked. Mark McGowan says the federal government needs to rebalance its relationship with China.
If we lose our trading relationship with China, that is, in effect, a mass reduction in national income. Mass reduction. And that means big consequences for people's jobs, employment and living standards.
Fears continue to mount. Australian exporters are in for an onslaught of trade sanctions by China. Andrew Barr has unveiled a coalition cabinet for a new look ACT government with a much more prominent seat for the Greens. Shane Rattenbury will be the new Attorney-General, the most senior role held by a Green in the ACT. The parties promise they're ready and willing to work together and resolve their differences as they arise. Tom Lowry has this report.
Taking a familiar seat in a new ACT government.
I'm incredibly humbled to have the privilege of serving again as Chief Minister.
With a nod to vanquished foes and new opposition.
If I can be so bold, I offer one piece of advice. Be nice to the Chief Minister.
It was time to welcome new colleagues to the ranks.
I'm pleased that we are in the situation that we're in now, with two parties working together.
Shane Rattenbury is the new Attorney-General, the most senior government role held by a Green. His new Greens colleagues Rebecca Vassarotti and Emma Davidson will join him in Cabinet as Environment and Sustainable Building and Construction Minister and Minister for Disability and Mental Health. Labor's Tara Chain has also been promoted to Cabinet as the new Business Minister, taking the place of Suzanne Orr, who's been dropped to the backbench. With three ministers, the Greens are now 1/3 of the Cabinet.
We're going to have to forge some new ground here. But we go into this with our eyes open and knowing that we'll need to work together.
This is the assembly the community has handed us, and they want us to get on and govern. They don't want to see political parties bickering over the course of a number of years. They don't want to see us fighting over the spoils of office.
The ACT hasn't seen a government quite like this before. The Greens have been in Cabinet, but now they have a much stronger voice. That carries both opportunity and responsibility, and they'll have to learn to manage the two. Tom Lowry, ABC News, Canberra.
Lawyers for billionaire miner Clive Palmer have urged the High Court to strike out COVID-19 measures which shut Western Australia's borders, saying they're unconstitutional. Mr Palmer launched the challenge after he was denied an exemption to enter the state.
As others lined up across the Nullarbor, stalled by the shut borders, Clive Palmer geared up for a High Court showdown. Today, his lawyers told the High Court the border closure breached Section 92 of the Constitution, which guarantees freedom of movement between states. A key question is whether the closures are necessary or reasonable enough to make them exempt from the Constitution. But Western Australia's Solicitor General Joshua Thompson says it's really about the facts, citing a recent federal court ruling that found closing the border was the most effective at stalling the spread of the virus. We think those questions of fact have been found against them. Mr Palmer was absent from today's hearing despite his staff saying he was in Canberra. There was much discussion about Western Australia's plans to ease restrictions to some states in the near future. But Premier Mark McGowan says he's still very concerned.
Mr Palmer shouldn't be doing this. Mr Palmer's actions could damage the health and welfare of West Australians. They could damage the capacity of states to protect themselves.
States including Victoria and Queensland, as well as the territories including the ACT, will address the court tomorrow in support of Western Australia. Elizabeth Byrne, ABC News, Canberra.
After having to accept a virtual wage freeze, New South Wales public servants have another bitter pill to swallow. The Treasurer has announced future pay rises will be reduced to save more than $1 billion. Unions are furious and have vowed to fight the move. Here's Ashley Raper.
2 weeks out from the state budget and the spruiking has begun.
How good is it going to be out here? It was a car park before.
But in an economic crisis, the Treasurer concedes some policies will be a hard sell. That includes cutting pay rises for public servants.
These decisions I can accept aren't popular. I'm not here to be popular. I'm here to do what's in the right interest of the people of New South Wales.
For almost a decade, public sector workers have been eligible for a 2.5% pay rise each year. It'll now be capped at 1.5% for the foreseeable future.
It's completely fair and reasonable and very generous in the circumstances.
He's baking in a low-wage economy in New South Wales that will not lead to growth, will not lead to jobs and will not get us out of a recession.
This is not a new strategy for the Treasurer. In May, the government moved to freeze the wages of public servants for 12 months. Last month, the Industrial Relations Commission awarded workers a 0.3% increase.
The average prison officer is on $80,000 a year.
bills are coming in, there's increase to insurance and other bills. So to get the 0.3 and then next year 1.5 doesn't really keep pace with our outlay.
After winning the last battle with unions, the Treasurer has delivered his latest wage cap emboldened. The pandemic does give the government cover here, but it doesn't change the politics.
I think this is sneaky, I think this is underhand, and I think that Dominic Perrottet had this plan all along.
The government expects to save $1.8 billion over 3 years. Ashley Raper, ABC News, Sydney.
Time for a look at the weather now. Here's Graham Creed.
Cold front have been moving through the southeastern states. Now, this has been bringing some strong and gusty wind with thunderstorms to parts of South Australia. We'll see some of those thunderstorms moving through Victoria tomorrow and into the southern districts of New South Wales later in the day. We've also had some severe thunderstorms with damaging winds about the far north coast of the Territory. We could see some isolated severe thunderstorms redevelop across this region again tomorrow. Unfortunately, it's not rainfall, it's damaging winds that will be a feature with those once again. And a very hot and dry day for most of Queensland. There is the potential of an isolated shower about the northeast coast, so the northeast tropics and about the coastal parts of the peninsula, but very hot conditions persisting over most of the northern inland.
Here are the top stories on ABC News. The Reserve Bank has cut interest rates by 15 basis points to a record low in an attempt to boost the Australian economy out of recession. The cash rate now sits at 0.1%. The central bank announced a raft of other stimulus measures, the most significant of which is a pledge to buy $100 billion in long-term government bonds, which expire in 5 to 10 years. Joe Biden has unanimously won the first town in the United States to count its votes as Election Day gets underway. The tiny township of Dixville Notch in New Hampshire holds a midnight ballot, with all 5 votes going the way of the Democratic challenger. Concerns are building in the US there could be violence as results come in, with city streets being boarded up